According to recent surveys, in just the last 2 years, Republicans' views of college have been tanking. Brandon Bastide, executive director at Gallup, conducted one of the surveys and joins us now for a closer look at the political divide over higher education in this country. Brandon, good to have you on the program.
Thank you, Tavis.
I just got through talking, as you saw, to the head of the Lumina Foundation,
Yep.
and their goal by 2025 is to make sure that 60% of we Americans have college degrees or more. And if I read your data correctly, many Republicans, a majority, in fact, now think that college may be, you tell me, is it dangerous or hazardous for America? What's the exact terminology here?
Well, first of all, Pew Research did some great work that they released in August, where they asked a question that they've been trending around overall: are colleges, more negative, more hurtful, to the United States or not? And so they released that, showing that 50% of Republicans say overall colleges are more hurtful to how things are going in the country. Completely tanked since 2015. So this is something that's happened very recently in the last 2 years. It's also not a Trump election effect necessarily. It goes back to a lot of the issues that started to arise on college campuses in 2015, protests on campus, a number of concerns and discussions about free speech, and then subsequently controversial speakers on campus. And so a lot of it has revolved around that.
What is the damage that has been, or the potential damage to be done to academia?
Yeah, I mean, so in the backdrop of this specific data about Republicans souring on higher ed, there's a lot going on in and around higher ed that are creating big challenges for it, right? You could just say overall, take Republican and Democrat split out of it, public perceptions of higher ed have declined. Right? I mean, 4 out of 10 Americans are, Republican or Republican leaning, right? So if you just, take that out of it, there's growing questions about the ROI, the return on investment of college. That's against the backdrop of higher education tuition going up 400% since the 1980s. Americans are now shouldering $1.4 trillion worth of student loan debt. $1 trillion of that has been added since 2003 alone. So, there's a mix of stuff going on here. It's not as simple as Republican souring, but Gallup did follow-up research after we saw the great research that Pew had done. We asked a question about overall, how confident are you in higher education? And regardless of where you landed, we just said why, right? So if you said I'm very confident, if you said I'm not confident at all, we just asked an open-ended question. And it's interesting, although more Republicans are negative about higher ed than Democrats, the Democrats who are negative about it for very different reasons than why Republicans are negative. So Republicans' top reasons for being negative about higher ed are it's too liberal, don't allow students to think for themselves. That's it. That's pretty much the whole story. I mean, there's more beneath that, but those are the driving reasons why Republicans say they're negative. For Democrats who are negative, again, fewer negative than Republicans, their top reason is it's too expensive. Now, so if we're going to address the problems, with higher ed, public perception challenges of higher ed, we're going to have to address them in different ways, right? If we think about the partisan divide. But the interesting thing on the flip side is that for those who are positive, Republicans and Democrats who are positive, they're positive for the same exact reasons. They had a positive experience with higher education. They see higher education as critical to the country and to getting good jobs.
The thing that scares me the most, and you kind of intimated this a bit earlier, is what happens to our nation when we start to think that there is no value, or when we start to think that the value of an education is not worth the effort that one has to make to attain it. That's the scary part, that we start to devalue education.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, these are the real implications, right? If you think about one of the, the strongest economic drivers, right? Absolutely. Higher education, post-secondary education. If we want to just give it a broader context for people, because I think sometimes when we use the word college, right, people have this preconceived notion of a traditional 18 to 22-year-old living on a college campus. If we say post-secondary education, we now start thinking about the very diverse U.S. higher education system we have of community colleges, of colleges that are serving adult learners right now. I mean, there's a huge mix of this, but you're already seeing some of the implications of this, right? So, you look at University of Missouri, which was one of the first ones involved in some of the protests. Their enrollment right now is down 30%. They've shuttered some 10 dorms in that time frame. You read articles in the local newspaper in St. Louis, and it ends with quotes from parents who are saying, I would never send my kids to the Berkeley of the Midwest, right? Talking about the University of in Missouri, right? So if we don't think this has a real impact, potentially, not for all colleges, but in certain situations on enrollment, on state funding, right? When you think about Republican legislators who are, trying to pay attention to what, their constituents have asked for, there is a real challenge to this, but it goes to a whole bunch of other issues, like people saying, geez, I can't afford it anymore. Yeah. And if I can't go there and get a practical skill that leads to, a real job outcome, well then, that's a real challenge too. So
if I can assume, if you're telling me that Mizzou is losing enrollment or decreasing in enrollment, can I assume then, or can I go on a limb and just guess that some of the Christian colleges are seeing a spike in enrollment?
Well, so I don't have that data to substantiate that from the perspective of the research I've done.
You see why I asked that, though. Yeah.
Although I would certainly say anecdotally, you look at institutions that have large growth in enrollment.
Right.
There are institutions that have specifically, they know who they're trying to serve.
Sure,
okay, and this is true in all cases. You take an institution like Babson, right? People actually know a lot about Babson. They think entrepreneurship. I mean, it has a bit of a signature. Most colleges and universities, if you say like, well, what's the signature of that education? Who's their customer? They actually have a hard time answering that or articulating that.
Did the data that you all gathered give you any sense of whether or not people are hopeful about the future of education versus just being down on it in this moment?
Yeah, so I don't know that we've necessarily asked a lot of questions that get at, what they think about it. I'll tell you this, though, and this comes from data we did as part of a Gallup Lumina poll that we worked on with Jamie Marasotis, was 8 out of 10 U.S. adults believe that higher education must change to adapt to meet the needs of current students, right? So there is a great sense among almost all of us, 80%, saying higher education needs to do something to cater to, the modern learner. And I think what is built around that is that there are more adult workers going back to college in various forms than ever before. If we want to hit those attainment goals that Lumina Foundation and others are talking about, it's going to have to come not just from traditional age students. I mean, literally impossible for it to come from traditional age students. It's going to have to include adult workers. And you think about the needs of an adult worker, going back to college, whether that's online, hybrid, going back to a physical campus, those are things that are a totally different ballgame. You've got kids, you've got a full-time job. That is a very different story. So there's a lot about higher ed that the U.S. population feels needs to change. And in our research studying college graduates and looking at their success in work and in life, we've identified some really key ingredients of what makes that higher education experience work. It turns out it's things like whether your professors, knew you as a person, that they actually cared about you as an individual, whether you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams, but it also includes really practical stuff like, did you have a job or an internship where you applied what you were learning in the classroom? Did you work on a long-term project that took more than a semester to complete? What's crazy about those last two, less than a third of U.S. college graduates strongly agree to either of those. So you say, okay, are there some real, things to look at in higher education? Yes, there are some structural things that I think need to be addressed. You look at the lens of, what makes for successful graduates. It's those kinds of things, and yet the scorecard for higher education is lower than it probably ought to be on those kinds of metrics.
Yeah. Here's the extra question, I think. What do you think? I know you didn't poll this, but do you have any sense of what the political implications are going to be? Because when you start seeing data like this, and it starts impacting, the future of higher ed or post-secondary education in this country, there are going to be some political ramifications at some point.
We've already seen pieces of this, right? The question is, will it be accelerated, right? Will it go in a new and different direction? But state funding for higher education in many states has been pulled back over the last several years, right? And so in states that have been, more Republican in nature, you can track and look at the fact that, state funding for colleges and universities in those states is down. The question is that going to continue? And that's going to put pressure on, raising tuition. There's a whole bunch of things that go into that. So where you have Republican state legislators who are listening to their constituents saying, this college thing, probably isn't worth it or whatever it might be, right? It's too liberal. It's going to, brainwash my kids. I mean, there's all kinds of, statements that, were analyzed under the hood of those open-ended questions that we asked. But, that's the real question, right? Is it really going to be exacerbated, or are we looking at a time frame here of a couple years where there's been a very fast souring And is there going to be recovery in, you know, how Republicans feel about higher education? I mean, I think if there's a recovery, it's going to come from seeing more colleges and universities develop practical kinds of degrees and programs, right? And this is not, this is the interesting thing, this is not a mutually exclusive conversation, right, of the liberal arts or careerism, or the liberal arts or vocational training. We actually dumb down this conversation by painting that as an either or. Those are not mutually exclusive. We need to get over that. Those things, that's a both and. And yet we create, you know, a distinction between those two things, and that's part of the problem. Higher ed creates that distinction in that conversation, you know, and I think you're seeing the American public make that distinction because you ask the question, what's the purpose of college? And guess what? When you ask people that, they have many answers. Okay, so it's not singular, but at the top of their list is to get a good job. So that's number one no matter who we ask. Parents of 5th through 12th graders, college freshmen, as UCLA does in their famous SERP survey. You know, regardless of who you ask the question, the number one reason is get a good job. But underneath that, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why we value it, right? To become well-rounded and an engaged citizen, and you know, I mean, those are all things that are up there as well. But it's like we treat those as being mutually exclusive. Like you know, if you go for one, you can't have the other. I think that's ludicrous.
There you have it. Tonight, an education on education in our country. Thanks to Brendan Bastide of the Gallup organization. Brandon, thanks for your research, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good to have you on.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep the faith.